Już tego wszystkiego mam. No. So I guess it's 1400 hours. So we should start our today's engineering seminary. Please welcome warm, wonderful person, Dr. Maksymilian Brzezicki, MD, PhD. Person who has the ability to combine medical science, medicine, and of course AI and engineering. A person who right now works with us. I'm very glad of it. So today we're gonna hear a lecture about how to examine a patient in space, the use of machine learning, sensor and brain computers interfaces in extraterrestrial scenarios. We all work to develop space technologies, and of course we want to send people to space, not only to the International Space Station, but of course to Moon or even further to Mars. We need to know how to help them, how to examine them, and how to make them healthy and without the need of coming back to Earth. So I guess Max will be one of the persons who will bring this idea to life. So please listen to him. He's also a great speaker. So I'm sure today's lecture is going to be excellent.
All right, thank you so much for that, and good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. Today, I've been given 30 minutes to talk about some of the most exciting engineering and medical science behind remote, objective, and calculated medicine. And we'll learn how to examine patients both on Earth, in very remote areas, in subpolar regions, or in some of the Outer Hebrides of Scotland, and also perhaps on the International Space Station, how we can learn from what we know from Earth and apply it to your extraterrestrial scenarios. But before that, a shameless plug. We have recently set up the Polish Astromedical Association, which is an association of people who are interested in medicine, in space medicine, of physicians and scientists, mathematicians, engineers, and everyone who thinks that they can contribute to that growing field. And I would like to invite you all to follow us on all the social media and also to sign up using the link that you see over there. And of course, all that work wouldn't be complete without a lot of people who supported me on the way. I have to say that my default thesis has 3 A4 pages of acknowledgements of all the people who supported me. And again, that wouldn't fit on a one slide, but a quick shout out to everyone who was key to developing some of these things that you'll see today. So I'd like to start by telling you a story. So I'm a practicing physician, and I like to spend some time in clinic, of course, looking after my patients. And one day I got a phone call from a patient, and he said, "Doctor, I need 2 days off work." That's always a good sign if someone knows exactly that they need 2 days off work. That's usually a red flag. And I say, "Okay, fine. What kind of symptoms do you have?" And he said, "Well, I've got cold. I've got cold symptoms." And I asked, "How long have you been having them for?" And he said, 11 years. And I was like, "Okay, so you've been cold for 11 years?" And he said, no, I'm fine now. But I was cold 11 years ago and I didn't take any time off. I'd like to claim it now, please. I needed to explain to him that unfortunately taking time off work doesn't quite work like that. You can't quite bank all those days in the past. But it made me think, this was almost like treating a disease that happened 11 years ago. So all the information I had about the patient, all the symptoms, all the vital signs, all the observations and so on were 11 years old. And I needed to make decisions based off of that, which obviously at the time was impossible. But if we think about future space applications, sometimes we'll have to develop protocols and medical scenarios that will need to assume that whatever's happening will be half an hour, 10 minutes, 45 minutes, an hour away from us. And how do we adapt our ways of practicing, of reacting to medical emergencies to that scenario when we don't really have a live feed and we all need to assume that what we're getting is at least a few minutes old? What happens with those medical emergencies that require immediate action? So what happens if I need to react within 1 minute or 30 seconds, but the signal coming through me can be delayed by 30 minutes? So we then need to think about how do we measure this and how we apply some of the engineering scenarios to be able to help in those cases. So let's think about how to examine this patient in clinic and how to examine this patient remotely. And we can do this by studying something that we know. It's always good to start from something that we are quite familiar with. And in my field, that is Parkinson's disease. So Parkinson's is a neurodegenerative disorder, actually one of the fastest growing neurodegenerative disorders in the world. And most of you will either have heard of it or have someone who has it or will have someone who will have it in the future. And of course, there are a few symptoms that we all associate with it. There's the slowness of movement, there's the characteristic gait, there's rigidity, tremors, and so on. But actually, it's more complicated than that. And if you have a look at this figure, you can see that there's a wide range of different motor symptoms that you see at the top of the graph, and also some of the non-motor symptoms. And in fact, if you have a look at the motor symptoms that we mostly care about, so bradykinesia, slowness of movement, rigidity, tremor, and so on, these are the things that we as doctors care about, that we see. This is something that we can put a finger on. But actually, a lot of these patients would present with something different. They'll talk about depression, constipation, anxiety, pain, fatigue, apathy, memory problems. So those things that we can't quite work out by looking at someone, because if someone's being slow in front of us in the queue, then yeah, fine, we'll be able to tell. But are they having memory problems? Are they having smell problems? Do they have REM sleep behavior? We don't know. And these things can actually be more important to the patient. So how do we measure that? How do we put it together? To understand this, we need to dig a little bit deeper. So let's think about where the disease originates. There's something called the basal ganglia in the brain, and these is a set of neurons that are responsible for coordinating movement, for making decisions, and for kind of integrating all those signals. And in Parkinson's disease, what happens is you've got a degeneration of some of these neurons, and you can see it over here. So on the left-hand side, there's a healthy person with a nice pigmented area called substantia nigra. And on the right, you see a person with Parkinson's disease, and you see that there's a loss of these pigmented neurons. And this is basically the neuropathology of it. And we see, okay, fine, we understand neuropathology, we understand some of these symptoms, but how do we get from here, from this disease, to a collection of symptoms? And of course, with medicine, everything's more complicated than that, as you can probably expect. So there's a few different things going on. There's the lysosome-dependent degeneration problems. There's mitochondrial dysfunction. There are signaling problems, I say nuclein proteostasis problems, and other things like pesticides, heavy metals, external factors. So again, the more we look into the disease that was simple to start with, yeah, fine, it's a shaky hand or it's a slow-moving person. Actually, we discover there's a lot of non-motor problems. Oh, and now we've got the substantia nigra that's degenerating. Oh, and now we've got all this that's also happening. And how do we measure this? How do we actually integrate it in a system that we'll be able to understand from a medical engineering point of view? And of course, it's even more complicated than that if you think about connections in the brain, because that's what's happening on the individual cell basis. But if you have a look at the connections in the brain, you've got the motor, oculomotor, prefrontal, limbic cord loops, and all sorts of different connections of different parts of the brain that need to work together to execute all these functions. And all of them will have a pathology that will be involved in Parkinson's. So again, that's a super complicated picture that we need to kind of quite integrate. Why do we care about this? Because we can actually use some of these pathways, for example, the direct, indirect pathways, to try to modulate it. In other words, to try to treat the patient with Parkinson's disease. And to do that, what we do is we basically look at the brain as a set of connecting wires, just like an engineer would do. And then we try to connect two things that are misconnected or where something's not quite working correctly, and use electricity to make it work. And I'll show you how it works in a second. So we put a little electrode in a part of the brain, again, you've heard it before, the basal ganglia in something called subthalamic nucleus, STN, or in globus pallidus interna. And then we connect it to the pulse generator that we hide under your collarbone, just something like a heart pacemaker. And with that, as you can see over here, we are able to actually both provide stimulation, but also read some of the local field potentials and some of the wiring of the brain, which again will come in handy later on. This is how the operation works. So we basically work out where we want to go. We then work out the X, Y, and Z coordinates of where we're going. Then we plan it way ahead of time to work out where we go in that particular patient using things like CT scanners and MRIs. And then intraoperatively, we kind of integrate it all together and put the electrode where it needs to sit, and then confirm, obviously, with other imaging that we know where we're going, because this obviously is quite a small area in the brain, and we can't just like poke around and see what works. We need to know exactly where we're going, and we've got some feedback loops and imaging to help us with that. Does it work? Well, let's have a look. This is a video that I really like because it's from a documentary that the BBC have made about this procedure. And you'll be able to see one of our patients who was operated on. So this patient is in the middle, and he's got the stimulator put in, and we're going to switch off the stimulator and just observe the hand. So you can see the quality of life of this person is quite poor if you think about dressing yourself, eating, and so on. But let's stimulate the SDN. And there you go. And this procedure makes great television because you basically can switch it on and off, and it's perfect. And by the way, it's interesting because the BBC journalist over there, he was absolutely flabbergasted by what was happening, later developed Parkinson's disease, and was also operated on by us and had another documentary. But that's a kind of circle of life, if you like. So how to assess this patient for surgery. So we've got this amazing understanding of how Parkinson's works. We know all these symptoms and so on. We now need to select someone for the surgery. So it works very well for selected patients. How do we work out who should get it? The stakes are quite high because the surgery is quite expensive in terms of the post-operative treatment and so on, and in terms of the stimulators. So how do we actually examine the patient? How do we work out who should get it? We've got a few things that we can consider. And on this graph, I would like to show you different methods of assessment, if you like. So again, we think about how to examine this patient in different ways that we can use to plan surgery, but also to plan whether this has actually worked or not. And we can either use the standard, so that is the normal assessment by a human, that will obviously have all the negatives of seeing a human, which is you need to be present, you need to be able to rely on the human, you need to have a human that's obviously certified to do this. Or we can use some of the automatic ways, and we'll be going through them throughout this presentation. So let's do the human assessment first. And for that, I'll need a volunteer. Jarek will come in and see. Okay. Thank you very much for being part of this examination. So I'm going to demonstrate how we examine patients with Parkinson's disease for deep brain stimulation. That's okay. So this, based off of that, I will decide whether to drill a hole in your head and implant you with a very expensive stimulator. So the stakes are quite high, right? Are you ready? Okay. So I am a registered physician with an MDS, Movement Disorder Society, International Movement Disorder Society certificate of how to conduct this very intricate examination that is the gold standard of assessment of Parkinson's disease. Are you ready? Okay. So what you need to do is you need to extend your hand like that, make a nice L shape with the thumb and the finger, then tap with the thumb and finger like that, then come back to a nice extended L every single time. And do it as fast as you can, as accurate as you can for 10 times. Ready, go. Yeah, well done. Okay. And that is actually perfect. Thank you very much. Yeah, that was all the assessment. So based off of that, we decide whether to drill a hole in someone's head, where to put the placement of the stimulator, and how to stimulate it. based off of that. For an engineer, that's just complete madness, right? You think like, you guys are crazy. Like, you doctors just make decisions based off of that? Like, and I'll tell you something even more probably interesting for you. We have a scale from 0 to 4, where 0 is a completely healthy person like you, and 4 is a dead person. And you can't give, it's only integer. So you can only give 0, 1, 2, 3, or 4. 4 is unable to do it. 0 is completely healthy. So for an engineer, that is completely bonkers to think about it, that you only have between 1, 2, and 3 to decide. Yet we use that as gold standard. So you can probably see why we should do something better than this. Okay, so we've covered that, and we know all the limitations of this because, for example, something that I'll say, oh, this was obviously normal, but I can say this is number 1 for me, for someone else it will be number 2, and for someone else number 3, and so on. So obviously it will be highly subjective. So let's talk about using a bit of a smarter thing for that. We can use something like this, which is a little sensor. So again, I'm going to do the same exam, but this time I'm going to put a little sensor on your finger, on your index finger. Well, obviously not going to do it now, but I could theoretically do it. And then using the data from that sensor, I will be able to maybe think about how a neurologist will assess it. And I'll show you a bit more detail in a second. So what we do is we install 3 gyroscope, 3 accelerometers in that little sensor. Then we obviously get all the signal live over Wi-Fi and Bluetooth. Then we try to extract 3 features that the neurologists as physicians are interested in, which is the speed, amplitude, the rhythm. So obviously speed is how fast you do it. The amplitude is how far between the thumb and the finger you do it. And the rhythm is whether you do it rhythmically or whether you have some hesitations, freezes, and so on. And then we try to compute it in a scale, again, from 0 to 4, something that people will be able to understand. And we can do this using some very simple mathematics in terms of the digital MDS-UPDRS. This is called Movement Disorder Society Unified Parkinson's Disease Rating Scale. And conduct 2 types of analysis. We can have a look at number 1, which is more linear. So we are allowed to have float points for this kind of assessment. Or you can use something that's an ordinal regression. So you can have 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. So 1 will be more accurate, 1 will be more directly comparable. And what if we put it to test? So for this examination, what I've done is I've gathered a bunch of different neurologists, all MDS certified clinicians, and I've asked them to rate the patient. Then I used the sensor and I wanted to work out how much in agreement they would be. And again, you can see that in terms of the linear regression, it's quite nicely, and it kind of diverges around the 4 score, which is what you expect. And again, most of the errors in the bottom are kind of within 0 or 1, which is an accepted thing that the Movement Disorder Society kind of accepts. This is okay. You can kind of make 1 or 2 errors. Now, again, you can get into a little bit of philosophical discussion. Does it mean that the human is wrong and the machine is actually assessing it accurately, and this error is not mathematical error, that's a human error, or whether the algorithm can't quite work it right? And I'll leave that obviously up to you to decide. I think the machines are a bit more accurate, but of course, different people can think something different. But at least this shows you that we are able to replicate, even with a simple sensor, this exam that we use for deep brain stimulation surgery without actually having any human present, which I think is quite a good start. Okay, and we can also do something called a levodopa challenge when we do a change. So we give people extra medication. So we first deprive them of the medication, we give it back, and then we see the change in the status. So again, if you have a look at at what the machines are doing, it's kind of more accurate, and you see the changes are sort of more put together. And when it comes to humans, some of them make some errors. In fact, I find it funny that some people thought that the patient got worse after giving the medication, which obviously is a human error. But again, it's up to you to decide which one's better. Okay. Now, can we do even better than this? Yeah. So this was trying to imitate a human assessment, right? So we're trying to imitate 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. But that's only because humans work that way. What if we could imitate, or maybe go further than that, and actually produce something that's in meters and seconds, in degrees per second, or how many steps you take when you turn, and so on, some physical, proper engineering units. So let's have a look at that. So we can add to this assessment the assessment of walking. And to do this, we turn the patient into a little Christmas tree. And we've got a 2-minute walk and 30-second postural sway. So again, this is one of our students who is walking with all these sensors on. And above there, it's just standing student, the same student for 30 seconds. And this is the placement of the sensors. So we see we've got some IMU sensors on the trunk, wrists, lumbar, and foot. And to work out which phases of the gait we're interested in, we can break it down into small segments. So learning response, mid-stance phase, pre-swing, swing phase, etc. And we can work out from this backwards what kind of features we would need. And then from those features, we can do further pre-processing that I'll show you in a second. But the features you get are kind of more physical, more engineering-like. So you see things like single limb support, or what is the percentage of the gait cycle time you spend in those different cycles, or what's the postural sway frequency dispersion in sagittal plane, or what's the stride length in meters and degrees. So you see, we start seeing some physical units, some engineering units that we'll be able to understand. And the hope with that is that we are able to use those engineering units to design an algorithm that will be able to remotely assess this patient. So instead of sending someone, a neurologist, to live with them in Mars or ISS or whatever, we can just send them a few of these sensors, because they are able to actually work all that out from that algorithm and will be able to make decisions based on that. So does it work? Again, what we've decided to do is to compare it against humans. And this is what we have done. On the left-hand side, you can see how the patient progresses in the disease, and the visits are 3 months apart, so the visits to clinic. And on the right-hand side, you see how the machine was assessing these patients. And you can see that the human assessment is kind of all over the place, and there's lots of variation in the scores. And actually, the machine is quite well put together, because, again, probably because of the precisions of these physical units. And actually, you can see that at visit 6 and 7, we start seeing statistical significance. So we see that this machine is able to see the progression of the disease, to see a physiological signal that we know. So all these degenerating black bits that you saw at the very beginning of the presentation, that machine is seeing it at the level of visit 6 and 7, so earlier than any human could do. Which is very exciting for us, because obviously we like precision. And we can be more reassured, okay, you can see an actual physiological signal. If we send this with you to Mars, the physiological signal will be able to be reliably read from that point of view. And obviously this was published, and then our university got very happy about this. And we even got a mention in a little provincial newspaper called the New York Times. Okay, can we do better than this? Yes, I think, what if we can maybe take an even deeper look and have a look at patients and how they react to medication? So we already know that all these sensors can measure progression of the disease. Let's have a look and see if these sensors can see the changes in the medication. And for that, I'll just show you very quickly how the medication works in Parkinson's disease. What we're trying to do is we're trying to replace the missing neurotransmitter, which is levodopa, which you can see over here. So this is the thing that's missing in the pathology of Parkinson's, and we give people medication with that molecule to be able to replace that. So whereas before you saw a kind of electrical stimulation with DBS, over here you see a more kind of physiological stimulation with neurotransmitters. Okay, so can the machines actually detect changes caused by these medications and maybe inform when we should start it? And for this, we use something that I'll show you over here. This was quite an interesting experiment, because to be able to do that, what you need is patients who haven't taken the medication, which is very rare, because most patients with Parkinson's will be started on medication almost like a diagnostic thing. So you'll be diagnosed with Parkinson's, you'll be put on medication, and that's it. Now, in order for us to measure the effect of the medication, we really need people with diagnosis of Parkinson's with no medication, which almost doesn't happen. It's only a few physicians that do that. Not only this, I really wanted this to be as natural as possible. So I didn't want to prescribe, okay, you need to start the medication now. I wanted them to start the medication when they needed it. So to measure the actual physiological process going on. And again, if you work within funding limits or within ethics and so on, and you only have this many time to be able to capture these patients, you only work in quite a small and narrow population, you deal with some interesting statistical problems because you end up with only 8, 9, 10 patients. How do you make statistics work for a few patients, especially if some of them, as you could see, and I divided it so that the visit 0 is kind of when they start the medication and the visits minus are before start, and these later ones are after. So how do you do this? Of course, you can't just use one metric because it's not going to make any sense, and people will say, oh, you're just fishing for the result, right? But what I thought about this is very similar to astronauts, because very often we have evidence from different space missions that only have a handful of people, and we've got the same problem. How do you make a few dots on the graph work, and how do you actually make it statistically solid? So I thought, okay, so why don't we try doing this a different way? Why don't we try having a look at one thing, but from different angles? So over here, for example, I'm not going to be using just finger tapping speed, what I've done just a second ago. I'm going to use a different way. So pronation, supination, speed, pronation, supination, amplitude, gait speed, arm range of motion, stance, mean as a percentage of gait cycle time. So if you think about it, these are various different ways of calculating the same pathology. So I'm looking at the speed in terms of MDS-UPDRS here. I'm looking at the speed here in degrees or meters per second in gait cycle time and in digital UPDRS. So again, I'm looking at the same thing. And the hypothesis is, yes, individual lines may not make sense, but if I see the same thing happening, all those different trends, maybe I'm onto something. Right? So if I see, okay, so this patient obviously was getting worse because MDS-UPDRS, the more you do, the worse you get. And then what happened? We started doing something. So we started medication, and look at that. The patient actually flatlined. So the patient's progression was masked. And again, that same thing is happening over here as well. So all these, you can see that there was an increase or getting worse. And after the intervention, there's an improvement. So again, with an eye of faith and statistical magic, you can tell if we see the same thing using different metrics and you see the same thing over and over and over again, maybe we're onto something. So that's an interesting thing for space medicine as well. And again, the next thing we can try to predict is whether maybe we can predict the falls in 5 years' time. So a fall is quite a catastrophic event for a patient with Parkinson's disease because they'll create a lot of healthcare problems and so on. And I wanted to see whether we can predict the fall in 5 years' time. So for that, I followed our patients up for 24 months and 60 months. And I wanted to identify, again, a small numbers of fallers happening in 24 and 60 months' time and see whether these signals can give me more pieces of the puzzle. And using some of the classification methods, as you can see over here, I was able to achieve 84% accuracy with the team working on that, of course, up to 60 months' time. And with that, again, you can see these are different ways of looking at this. These are different models, but again, they are looking at the same pathology. So I've got evidence of progression. I've got evidence of medication. I've got evidence of falls in the future. Again, maybe I'm onto something. Maybe actually all this is measuring something important, and I think it is. Okay, so the last thing I wanted to show you is a bit of raw units, so something that engineers really like. So fine, because this is kind of pre-processed, meters per second, etc. Obviously algorithmically pre-processed so that the signal can be more interpretable. But what if we can get to the real detail of having the milliseconds of volts and seconds and so on? And for this, I've designed this little machine over here that is able to measure the movement of the arm in every 1 millisecond. And I looked at some of the features from that. And you can see it over here. So again, from the initial time series of intertap intervals, so patients tapping in between those different two plates, you're able to compute things like tap-to-tap change intervals. You can use Poincare analysis, and you can use things like the frequency of tapping of the rolling average to see things like fatigue and changes in rhythm. So again, you can dive even deeper and deeper and deeper into this. And from one machine, that actually is quite an easy thing to kind of fit in and use on the space station. You're able to compute more and more things if you want to look into the finer detail. And I'll show you how it works. So again, I've tested these patients in terms of the medication on and off. And you see on many of these features, medication actually changed it, with obviously some of the people being more dramatically changed than others, in things like standard deviation of the intertap interval, of the error rate, of the mean tab duration, and so on. Same thing happened in the stimulation. So again, when I switch the stimulator on and off, we see changes in very similar metrics, and SD1 from Poincaré analysis, so the analysis of change. And for the GPI stimulation, we didn't actually see that much, which again, we were expecting, because for GPI, it's a different target in the brain that shouldn't affect bradykinesia as much in that context. So again, we've got another bit of evidence to the puzzle that this actually can be reliably used for things like stimulation, for things like giving medication, for things like progression, for things like diagnosing patients. And again, you can even have a look at some of the magnitudes of tremor, again, changing and being measured with this. Okay, so then the next question is, do we even need the human, right? Because if all that can be done very easily by computers, then why do we need a physician? Why can't we just do away with me and all my colleagues and just leave the computer to do it all? And maybe on Mars, maybe that's what we need. Maybe we need a computer neurologist to decide everything, and then we'll be just sitting there on Earth and maybe checking with them every month or something. I don't know, maybe. You can do clever things like implant patients with something called the adaptive deep brain stimulation, when the human is almost taken out of the loop. Because what you do is you integrate all these sensors from the motion, posture, bioelectrical signals, circadian patterns, and so on. And instead of me sitting there and switching it on and off and trying to fiddle with the settings, you actually can get the computer to do it for you in live time. And you can dig deeper into that and see that you can identify some of the beta bands in the local field potentials, and then integrate things like the EMG signals, movement sensors, cortex, and so on, to be able to improve things like speech, physical exercise, walking, eating, sleep. So again, we now have all these algorithms who are able to integrate all that and improve patient outcomes for our patients. And you can see that for this study that we compared it against, these are scientific community, compared it against the adaptive DBS and chronic DBS testing, and adaptive DBS actually has resulted in better outcomes for the patients. And this is some of the other nitty-gritty that you can get into, where you can actually identify the specific bands that you can be stimulating at a given time to get better results. Maybe we need a computer and a little robot like that to examine all patients on Mars, and we'll be able to deal with humans all together. Okay, so in summary, I'd like to convince you that all the symptoms that we know from Parkinson's disease can lead to changes in physiology, and this physiology with imaging and locational networks can be then used to adequately treat these patients using some of these sensors. Okay, but you can ask, lastly, this is all nice and well because you've got all these sensors and all those different metrics and so on, but can you actually send this to space? What if we can't really send all this expensive equipment to space? Maybe it's not zero-G safe. Can we do something that's less invasive? And that's a fair question, because to examine this guy, you probably want something that's not going to destroy the whole station, and that's probably already declared as safe and so on. Can we use some of the stuff that we already have in there to be able to have a kind of comparable result? And for this obviously, why do we need this? Because there's an increased cognitive load. There could be neurological problems happening in space with longer space duration missions. We will need to be able to think about those things. And for safety, it should be non-invasive. It should have NASA bioethics, and it should also be zero-G safe. And we should be able to seamlessly integrate it in the workflows that we currently have over there, because obviously the logistical simulator, well, obviously we can all implant all astronauts with a stimulator. I would love to do that and to get them connected to some of my algorithms, but I don't think it will be quite safe for them. So what can we do then? We can actually think about different non-invasive techniques that we can use to correlate with highly detailed lab-generated tech. So some of my tech that I've already developed with other teams with non-invasive. And even if non-invasive is less specific and maybe less detailed, we can be satisfied that this is a kind of an acceptable standard for that standard. And we can do things like voice, human vision, and so on. So for example, voice, we can break down into the Mel spectrograms and try to get some of the features off of that. We can use some of the movement sensors and some of the computer vision. And I'll show you some very quick examples to finish off in a second, to be able to work out what we would usually be able to work from the sensors, or some biomarkers as well from blood from before the flight, or even some of the EMG. Maybe we'll be able to do that with a little project we do here at the CBK. Okay, so does it work? Let's see from this patient. So this is one of the patients that came to the university hospitals in Zielonej Górze, who was diagnosed with Parkinson's disease. And we use this system, which is a computer vision technique, completely non-invasive, to trace the displacement. As you can see, the algorithm can actually non-invasively detect all those features from the face. And after applying treatment, you see the changes almost immediate. And if you have a look at the signals in terms of the X and Y axis, you can see that this actually gives us maybe not the perfect resolution, but actually the resolution that we're able to apply using this analysis when we each day make changes based off of what we read from these computer vision settings to actually improve the patient. So maybe we don't need perfect resolution, we just need a resolution that works. And finally, this is another patient who was admitted to us with difficulty walking. Over here, you see she's freezing and she's sort of going towards the left. And she also had progressive dementia and so on. But again, we were able to use the computer vision technique and some of the non-invasive analysis to work out what was wrong with her. And after implanting the VP shunt, this is how she looks like. See almost immediate spectacular improvement for that patient. This is me for those English speaking, this is me speaking in Polish for that person. So, and see, she's quite uneasy about walking, but I'll ask her. Yeah. Yeah, look at the smile on her face. Very happy. Okay, and we can again use some of these other things, so we can include neuropsychometry, baseline tests, put it all together. So maybe we don't need an amazing dimensions. Maybe we just need this for our space medicine applications. Maybe we just need some of the voice features to be able to work it out. And the question then remains on what is the acceptable minimal standard that we're able to balance out both the requirements of the space mission and again the accuracy of the medical requirements of that. And on that note, I hope I can implore in you that the future does not begin today. The future does not begin tomorrow. The future is now. Thank you very much. And I'd like to welcome any questions you may have. Okay, how do you avoid damaging other parts of the brain during insertions of the device? Well, that's a very good question. You plan well. Easier said than done. So this actually is one of those surgeries that I love, because as an engineer, I just love just sitting in front of the computer and like focusing on tiny little details. This is a kind of surgery, I call it 6 hours of planning for 30 minutes of doing. So you sit with a nice cup of coffee, then you look at all the scans, then you do your trajectory, and then you try to remodel it in 3D. So we can actually go slice by slice to have a look where your bit will go in, and to make sure it doesn't hit any other important parts of the brain, any vessels and so on. So actually, sometimes we have a few plans, plan A, plan B, plan C. We have a look, oh, maybe this way or maybe that way. And actually, sometimes we even leave it and then wake up the next morning. So like, okay, I think I want to have a look at it again and see the planning. Then what happens intraoperatively, sometimes it doesn't quite map out, and then we need to make adjustment and so on. But actually, by using some of the stereotactic techniques, so by using high dimensional scans, and by using some of the frames and robotic arms, even are now beginning to be used, we are actually able to plan it quite well. And with well-planned procedures, we can avoid damaging important parts of the brain, although obviously the risk is still there. Okay. Any questions from CBK?
One funny question, because you can stimulate. So what about singers? Can you stimulate voice and any other feature of voice?
So what you mean is,
do you see any impact from?
Yes, yeah. So basically what you see is, because Parkinson's disease is a disease also of rigidity, yes, you'll have your phonation apparatus also involved with that disease. And actually, you see, once we stimulate properly, their speech also improves, and the swallowing also improves, and they're able to articulate it better. Not because we stimulate this particular nerve or the particular apparatus, but because the coordination of movement within the brain. So if you like, the preprocessor that actually sends electrical signals down to all these nerves is better that way. So it's kind of cheating, because we improve everything and we're happy and pat ourselves on the back. Look at us, we've also improved their voice. But yeah, that is a known improvement that we achieve with that stimulation. Not entirely, I have to say. This is not something that is sort of the top of the improvement scale, but we can actually see patients being able, especially with swallowing, because that's quite an important thing for Parkinson's. Yeah.
Okay. Well, first of all, thanks very much for a great talk, Max. And I love very much the sentence you ended your lecture with, computers now, which I believe in very much. Now, let me ask you this. Does that mean that we really mastered the way to treat Parkinson's disease, or we are far away from it? And if we have a patient that is suffering from Parkinson's, should they direct themselves to Zielonej Górze, to you?
Well, second is very easy. Yes, please. We accept referrals, so please come to us. Jokes aside, well, that wasn't a joke. Please come to us. In terms of the actual treatment of these patients, all those things that I have presented over here are not disease modifying, unfortunately. They are only symptom improvement. So to date, we do not have anything that will be able to stop all these neurons dying, unfortunately. There are a few drugs in preparation at the moment that are going through obviously clinical trials and so on. Maybe within the next, I'm actually very hopeful. I think within the next kind of 10, 20 years, we're able to see that. Actually, Alzheimer's disease is well ahead of us, because they started using some of the disease-modifying molecules that, actually, one of the disease-modifying molecules was approved in Poland this April. So this is quite exciting, and we in Zielonej Górze are preparing to maybe be one of the first centers in Poland who will administer it for Alzheimer's disease. But in terms of Parkinson's, unfortunately, all this is going to be symptomatic. Now, the question I will ask back at you is a little bit of a philosophical question. If you feel well, does it mean that we've cured your disease? If you're able to work, if you're able to go and do your shopping, if you're able to be independent, does it mean that we've cured your disease just because we kind of mask the symptoms? I think it's a kind of a philosophical question. It's almost like often we medicine say that today, say 70-year-olds are basically like 50-year-olds off a few years back. So we can't quite stop the disease, but we can make the symptoms better. And you can almost think about this in a kind of philosophical way. What if we can just maybe make the symptom treatment so good that you won't be able to feel the disease at all? That's a philosophical question. But in terms of the answer, symptom only disease modifying drugs, we currently do not have any approved ones for that one particular disease.
One more. You mentioned this Alzheimer's disease treatment in Warsaw. I think this is where Professor Ząbek really excels. What do you think should be done to excel in that kind of treatment, in that kind of advancement? What would you do were you the Minister of Health or the Minister of Finance, to make sure that there are centers like that in Poland that can offer world-class treatment to patients?
It's a very good question. Of course, we all can imagine ourselves as ministers of health and having a limited budget and so on. I still believe very strongly two things. First of all, that we should be providing the best medical care we can, and obviously within the means that we have. And especially for people with Parkinson's and with Alzheimer's, those neurodegenerative disorders, when they can still have quite a good quality of life, we should be doing our best to be able to support them in that. And if you want to be very cynical and very kind of mathematical, which you have to be as a Minister for Health, you can say, okay, these people can work. And they are at the zenith of a career, because at the time when they start developing, this is when they're in the 50s and 60s, that's basically the highest level of development this human will have in his career, right? That these will be professors, this will be managers, this will be people with a lot of experience. I think it's a bit of a shame that we don't try to prolong that time that they contribute back to the society, and of course pay taxes and pay your national health fund fees and everything, because if we can give that patient who's, say, 55-year-old, if we can give another 10 years or 15 years of life, good quality life, that is a really good investment in our centers, in our teaching, in our productivity in the factories and so on, because these people have a lot of experience and a lot of skills to offer. Now, in terms of research, I would definitely say we need to think about fundamental research, because, for example, what happened with Alzheimer's disease, they are way ahead of us as in Parkinson's, because there were a few very stubborn people who said, no, we need to diagnose this properly. We can't just say, oh, it's Alzheimer's, we never will be able to do anything. There were people who said, we need to be like oncologists. We need to be able to be happy that we've got the diagnosis. We need to work on treatments. We need to work on fundamental research, sometimes in research for research's sake. So sometimes for some kind of esoteric molecules that at the time didn't offer any immediate transactions. But from these projects, we learned, oh, we now know about alpha-synuclein, or we know about tauopathy, we know about this. And from that, we could develop new things. So I would definitely not be as kind of cynical with funding as some health ministers can be in terms of what's the actual benefit to humanity now. Yeah, but well, if we knew, then there wouldn't be science, right? Science sometimes is just looking for new things without knowing the results. That's what we should be doing more of, I think, in Poland.
Maybe one question.
Mm-hmm.
I think in Parkinson's disease we also have some drugs to help in situation.
Yeah.
So this stimulation can work combined with some drugs and have a better or less symptoms, or this not combined. So for example, we not see adding effect. You mean, I don't know what you mean.
Yeah. So actually, in fact, for SDN stimulation, these people need less medication. So once we improve the signaling pathways in the brain, what you often see is they need less of the neurotransmitter. But because Parkinson's is a progressive disease, all these neurons will keep disappearing. Unfortunately, they will keep degenerating. So at some point, they will need all that medication and will keep adding it and keep adding it, keep adding it. And unfortunately, the way it works in Parkinson's, you just need more and more and more medication until, unfortunately, it stops working, or it gives you a lot of side effects. You need to add a lot of different medications, a lot of different doses and stimulators. And some people have a few stimulators, actually. Some people have 2 stimulators, medication, and a pump, because you can also deliver the medication for a little pump. And that still isn't enough. But I would then argue, but this patient with all these interventions had 20 years of good quality life. And I think that's still worth doing. So yes, so with some of these treatments, we are able to avoid increasing medication. We're not going to be able to avoid using it at all, unfortunately. Not at the moment. Yes, repair mechanism. So currently, well, okay, so I can tell you in terms of prevention, because maybe that's what you all want to do. There's 3 things that I would offer that all you sitting here can do to prevent Parkinson's. Number 1, coffee. coffee is actually one of the best Parkinson's prevention molecule that we have. So please, I don't think we need convincing in this audience, but a few cups of coffee actually a day can lower your risk of Parkinson's. Exercise. So we actually have very good quality evidence that people who exercise even once a week, and exercise, I mean parking your car a few 100 meters away from where you need to be in the shop and actually walking, that's enough to give you huge percentages in terms of the risk prevention and sleep. So if you can fix your exercise, you can fix your sleep, and you can fix your coffee, then you'll be good in terms of repair mechanism. But unfortunately, what happens is in Parkinson's disease, the damage is almost done to an extent that is very difficult to repair once you start seeing the symptoms. So when you look at the symptom schedule that I show you in this little graph, when there was like REM sleep behavior. So for example, we know that problems with sleep or problems with the olfaction, so the smell, can precede Parkinson's by 10 years. So we see that someone had sleep problems. Maybe they were ignored. Maybe they thought, oh, this is just normal or whatever. But that was already happening 10 years. The 10 years of dying neurons. And by the time we see all these different things that you saw on the videos, it's almost too late because the disease is kind of unfortunately attacked too much of the brain. So all our efforts at the moment are both in primary prevention. So please, exercise, sleep, coffee. This is, if anything you need to take away from this is a doctor telling you to do these three things. And the next thing is, if we can use some of these sensors that I've shown you to be able to catch the disease early, then we can use some of the new disease-modifying drugs, so antibodies and monoclonal antibodies and so on, to be able to actually prevent the spread of the disease. So there are neuron mechanisms. The best neuron mechanism repair system is your own and happens when you sleep. So please get that fixed.
Wonderful. Thank you very, very much, Max. That was absolutely great, informative. And summing it up, yes, we can serve coffee at CBK. Yes.
Yes, that's
We
very
have a
good.
fitness
Preventing
room
Parkinson's.
finished, and as far as sleep is concerned, this is probably our biggest problem at the moment. Anyway, thanks very much, and until next time. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. Dzięki wielkie. Podobało się. Cieszę się. No tak myślałem, żeby tak, wiesz, podtrzymywać.